Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. I'm Robin Priestley with the Ramsey County Historical Society. First of all, I'd like to thank our partner, the Eastside Freedom Library, for setting up this program. We've been partners with the Eastside Freedom Library for 3 years now, and we're so grateful for that partnership and to be able to offer these programs formally in person and virtually right now. And we're working on programs for 2021. So all of the links are on the slide. So you can check out our website. And while you're there, please consider supporting the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library. Both organizations rely on the support of our members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and in all of our efforts. And there are some great benefits to joining. And again, those would be on the website, and feel free to contact us via email as well. This program will be recorded and available on our RCHS YouTube channel within a few days. And you can also check out past programs both on the RCHS YouTube channel as well as on the Eastside Freedom Library YouTube channel. So many of these programs are in both places. And then we also have on our channel other programs, Gibbs Farm programs. We have our Goose is hosting a series of videos on our YouTube channel, so be sure to check those out. And I also want to remind everybody that next month we're going to have a great program with Kim Heikkila on her new book on Booth Girls, Pregnancy, Adoption, and the Secrets We Kept. She is a fantastic speaker, and I'm really looking forward to having her come back again. It's a very personal story for her. And again, you may check out both of our websites for registration and sign up. Also, please feel free to join us after we turn off the recording. During the program, please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off and put your questions in the chat. Then after we turn off the recording, there'll be a little bit of time to network and we can all chat together. We will be watching questions on Facebook and here on Zoom, and we will have those at the end of the program. Peter and I will be monitoring those questions. The Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community, and we are so pleased to bring you tonight's program. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter Radcliffe from the Eastside Freedom Library.
Thank you, Robin, and I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Eastside Freedom Library. Wish that we could all be together in person, but without the possibility of doing that, we're all doing the best that we can. And one of the things that is made possible by the technology that we're working with is that we could have Donna Haverty-Stacke with us tonight without having to buy her a plane ticket or a hotel room. So Donna has zoomed in, as it were. So we're delighted to be co-hosting this program with the Ramsey County Historical Society. We've been trying, when we have an author event, to recruit a couple of local folks to read the author's book, who have various ways of entrance into that book. And we're delighted with the team that has assembled this evening. So I'm just going to introduce everyone very briefly. Donna Haverty-Stacke is professor of history at Hunter College of the City University of New York. She's a historian of the working class and radical politics, particularly interested in the intersections of that history with nationalism and collective memory, national security and free speech, gender identity, and Catholic activism. Her first book was America's Forgotten Holiday, May Day and Nationalism, 1867 to 1960. And her second book, which she presented at the Eastside Freedom Library in person, was Trotskyists on Trial, Free Speech and Political Persecution Since the Age of FDR. Donna is being joined tonight by three of our local community members. Greg Poferl, who's a lifelong labor and Catholic social activist and a generous collaborator at ESFL. Last year, Greg became an author. He wrote his memoir, Turning Points, Never Give Up on Anyone, Especially Yourself. It's the second book officially published by the Eastside Freedom Library. So far, none of us are going to be able to retire on the royalties, but we do encourage you to read Greg's book. Second is Linda Leighton. Linda is a lifelong labor activist who has played a major role in maintaining local memory of the 1934 Minneapolis Teamster strikes. And Mary Wingerd is our third reader and discussant, and she's an emerita professor of history at St. Cloud State and the author of Claiming the City, Politics, Faith, and the Power of Place in St. Paul, and North Country, the making of Minnesota. So what we're going to do is Donna's going to talk a bit about what brought her to this project and what is contained in the book. She also has some really cool slides that she's going to share with us while she's doing that. And then we will hear briefly comments from Greg and Linda and Mary, and then we'll have a bit of an exchange all around, and then we'll start to take questions typed in by audience members into the chat. So here we go. Donna, take it away.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm just gonna quickly share my screen here so we can see some nice photos. I just wanted to start by saying thank you to Peter and Carla and everybody at the Eastside Freedom Library, and Robin and everyone at the Ramsey County Historical Society for organizing this evening. And a special thanks to Linda, Mary, and Greg for coming and joining in the conversation. Being at the Eastside Freedom Library, as it were, albeit virtually, it feels in many ways like a homecoming for me and for Grace in a way. And when I was at the very early stages of this book, Peter kindly invited me to give a presentation at the library about the project. And so it seems fitting to be here again now that the book is done and to be able to celebrate it and talk about it. And it really does seem fitting to be talking about Grace, albeit virtually, in her hometown of St. Paul. I became interested in writing a biography about Grace Carlson after coming across her story in the research for my previous book on the 1941 Smith Act trial. But given the broader scope of that book, I only really scratched the surface of Grace's life. She was one of the 29 defendants in that case and one of the 18 who were convicted of advocating the violent overthrow of the government. And her story was one of many that I traced out in a larger argument about the tension between free speech and national security in times of national emergency. She was an important part of that larger history, but just one part. So after I finished the book on the trial, I was anxious to delve more deeply into Grace's life. And part of what drew me to Grace were the different facets of her life that I sensed connected up to larger themes in American history. Some of them perhaps more familiar stories, but many of them less so. Uncovering her life as a way to excavate those less familiar parts of the past was what really intrigued me. It was not just her years in the Socialist Workers Party that I knew could shed light on the experiences of women on the radical political left. And that was something I touched on briefly in the book on the trial and then opened up more in the biography. But also her childhood and young adult life before she entered the party, and her life in the years after she left the party, I sensed could open up avenues of inquiry into a whole host of historical topics. And I came to understand as I worked through the research and wrote the book, that those topics included how working class subjects come to be, particularly as influenced by their natal families, their hometowns, and significant events during their childhoods, the nature of lived Catholicism, particularly how the Catholic faith informed working class subjectivity for people like Grace, as well as how it could shape progressive and even radical political consciousness, and how that progressive shaping could happen even before Vatican II. And then another theme is the variance of 20th century feminisms, particularly different working class and Marxist versions that were articulated between the first and second waves of feminism. On the topics of lived Catholicism and feminism, I had a lot of work to do as a scholar who had not researched those particular histories in depth before. And in many ways, it was with those topics that I had the most fun engaging as I approached them through the lens of Carlson's life. As I researched and wrote the book, I also came to realize that one of the things I was trying to do as a scholar was to bring together in conversation different subfields of history that more often than not did not talk to each other. And chief among these were the labor and working class history and the history of religion, but also perhaps to a lesser degree, the history of socialism and the history of feminism. And I had not planned to set out on that historiographical mission, but Grace's life led me to the task because in order to tell her story fully, I needed to address certain questions central to the histories of working class life, labor, socialist movements in the United States, electoral politics, Catholicism, Catholic social teaching, lived religion, and feminism. And we can perhaps dig into some of those historiographical and methodological issues in the conversation and the Q&A. But for now, I'll just note that it wasn't always easy to bridge those divides in the field. I did get a little pushback from certain quarters. The importance of both organized religion and faith was a theme that informed much of chapter 1 of the biography, in which I examined Grace's childhood. In that chapter, Beginnings, I also explore the relationship between Grace's working class natal family in her St. Paul Rice Street neighborhood and the early formation of her political consciousness. Integral to that consciousness was a working class identity understood in terms of labor solidarity and a commitment to social justice. Grace's commitment to the working class was shaped in part by her experience of the 1922 shopman strike. Her father was a boilermaker on the Great Northern Railroad. He went out on strike. She was a teenager at the time, and it had a deep impact on her and her family. Her commitment to social justice and to serving others was forged very much by the Sisters of St. Joseph, who taught her at St. Vincent's Parish School, and this is when the church was being built before she was born. They also instructed her at the Academy of St. Joseph High School. Many of those women were also staunch supporters of Irish independence, and they, along with Grace's experience of the patriotic hysteria that surrounded World War I, also fostered what she later called her independent thinking. Grace learned at an early age from these influences to be skeptical of the government and of movements that demanded unquestioned conformity. In chapter 2, Conversion, I trace Grace's years at the College of St. Catherine, which she attended from 1924 to 1929, and where she remained a devout Catholic who deepened her faith-driven commitment to serving others. And I'll just try to point to her here. This is her here in the middle of her class. In this chapter, I also examine Grace's gradual abandonment of that faith and her turn to socialism during and immediately after her years at the University of Minnesota, where she received a PhD in psychology in 1933. Central to her conversion to socialism, I argue, during the mid to late 1930s, were her experiences at the U, her introduction via her sister Dorothy to the Trotskyist leaders of Teamsters Local 574, her exposure to the historic 1934 Minneapolis Teamster strikes, and her growing involvement with what would become the Socialist Workers Party by 1938, and all of this situated, of course, in the context of the Great Depression. During the same years that Grace drew closer to the Trotskyists, she also met Gilbert Carlson, a law student whom she married in 1934. She and Gilbert separated by the late 1930s when Grace left the church. And she also left her first job at the Minnesota Department of Education in 1940, and then committed herself full-time to working for the Socialist Workers Party. By 1940, she had become a full-time organizer in Minnesota and launched her first campaign for the US Senate. In chapter 3, Sisterhoods, I shift the trajectory of the biography somewhat from a chronological unfolding of events to examine more thematically Grace's relationship with other women in the SWP, including her sister Dorothy and her friends Bea Janosko, Elaine Roslin, Miriam Braverman, and others over the course of her time in the party. The dynamic of Grace's female friendships is captured in her voluminous correspondence, which shows how, as comrades, mothers, wives, and friends, these women fought alongside men in the party to advance the liberation of workers in ways distinctly inflected by their gendered experiences and supported by their socialist sisterhood. That sisterhood proved especially important in sustaining Grace during the year she spent at Alderson prison. That was from January 44 to January 45, after her conviction under the Smith Act in 1941. Grace's experience in prison contributed to her articulation of a particular working class and Marxist feminism that we can see in her writings for The Militant and in the Women in Prison speaking tour that she conducted from June to September of 1945. In this chapter, I argue that Grace, along with other women in the SWP, gave voice to a Trotskyist brand of feminism that is largely absent in the historical literature of both the political left and feminism. And this was not a middle-class individualist understanding of women's equality that sought protection in the Equal Rights Amendment, but was closer to the labor feminism of union women in the post-war period. This working class feminism was, however, also Marxist in its ultimate goal of overthrowing capitalism as the root cause of all oppression. Grace and her friends did not use the term feminist to describe themselves, and they did not articulate a critique of patriarchy, which would become so central to second wave feminism. Instead, their struggles in Grace's writings show a gradual evolution in thinking about the class-based experience of gender, which was coming to include a recognition of housework and mothering as productive work, as well as some acknowledgement of certain forms of cultural oppression. And that line would be developed more in the SWP later in the 60s after Grace had left the party. But for the time she was still in the party, late 40s, early 50s, her writings, her speeches, and those of the other women in her orbit, I think adds to the history of how those on the left in that period answered the woman question, and shows how during this period between the first and second waves, feminism was anything but in the doldrums. In chapter 4, Politics and Love on the Left, I explore Grace's run for vice presidency of the United States on the SWP's first national electoral campaign ticket in 1948, noting the prejudice in the press coverage she faced as a woman candidate, but also as a revolutionary socialist who was running in the early years of the Second Red Scare. I also examine in this chapter Grace's separation from Gilbert and the private romantic relationship she conducted with fellow partisan Vincent Raymond Dunn from the late 30s until 1952, turning once again to a more thematic approach as I had done in chapter 3. Drawing from the work of Liz Pfau and Kathleen Brown, I argue that uncovering these private ties reveals how the personal relationships of Grace and her contemporaries on the left during the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s shaped the everyday experience of their political commitment. These relationships helped build and sustain the radical politics of those involved in the movement, those who otherwise faced a world hostile to their political beliefs. In chapter 5, The Break, I consider the factors that contributed to Grace's decision in June of 1952 to leave the SWP and return to the Catholic Church. Those factors were largely personal ones related to her father's death and her reassessment of her life. She did not leave the party because of a political disagreement or in a factional split. She refused to inform for the FBI and indeed continued to consider herself a Marxist. But she had come to realize that she needed God in her life again. And through the spiritual guidance of Father Leonard Cowley at St. Olaf's Church in Minneapolis, she returned to the church. She also then reunited with Gilbert. But as I show in this chapter, these were difficult years for her at first. She had broken with her life as she had known it for over 15 years. And that included breaking the connection she had with her comrades in the SWP, particularly her party sisters and her biological sister, Dorothy. They were estranged for a few years until Dorothy and Dorothy's husband, Henry, also left the party in the early 1960s. Grace also broke with her comrade and lover, Ray Dunn. Because she had been blacklisted as a former high-level SWP member, she also could not find a job at first. And it was with the help of Father Cowley and also Sister Rita Claire Brennan at St. Mary's Hospital, where she found a job first as a secretary in the pediatrics department, and then a few years later, she became the social director of the nursing school, and then eventually, in 1957, she was hired as a faculty member. She then became deeply involved in the work and mission of what became St. Mary's Junior College, working very closely with Sister A.J. Moore for many years. In chapter 6, Carlson's continuing commentary, I take that title from a column Grace wrote when she retired from teaching for St. Mary Junior College's newspaper Good News. Grace remained very involved in the alumni work until 1984. In this chapter, I explore how during her years at St. Mary's Junior College from the early 60s through 1984, Grace articulated a unique form of Catholic activism and relished in the opportunities she had, as she said, to teach and practice social justice. I attribute the formation of that activism to various influences. In her childhood and young adult life, there was the impact of the Josephites on her understanding that serving others was a gospel mandate that remained with her. There may also have been her exposure to the beginnings of the Catholic Action Movement in the early 30s when she was still in the church, a movement that called on Catholics to practice their faith in socially engaged ways. But certainly upon returning to the church in 1952, there were many quarters where she did not feel comfortable. She found more progressive spaces to sort of redefine herself. She brought the years of her experience she had as a Trotskyist and her education in Marxism that kept her oriented to the struggle against capitalism. But she now also familiarized herself again with the social teachings of the church, as well as by the 1960s, other currents emerging in the Catholic left, especially obviously the impact of Vatican II, to ground this class struggle in her faith. And that her approach to her faith makes sense then why she was attracted to the English Slant movement, a group of Catholic Marxists in England. She found kind of kismet with them, as it were, and their focus on the political dimension of Christian renewal. And living out her faith in this socially engaged way, in these years, we see Grace supporting civil rights, anti-nuclear and anti-war causes that were a part of the New Left, even though she diverged from the New Left in her analysis of an approach to those struggles. And this becomes clear in her speeches and her correspondence, where we see Grace constructing a specific form of Catholic activism that was at times inflected with insights from her old left Trotskyist days, with its emphasis on the need for disciplined organization and education of the masses who themselves had to be the agents of systemic change, not, for example, what she saw as the individual acts of personal witness conducted by the Berrigans. In these later years of her life, Grace also continued her struggle for women's equality in ways that came to include, somewhat ironically now that she was back in the church, a critique of cultural patriarchy, not just capitalist oppression. And in that way, I think she provides something of a bridge between old left and new left feminism, another theme that we could perhaps discuss today. But I'll just end by noting, as I do at the end of the introduction, that Grace, who was, as one of her friends called her, an amazing woman, may not have been representative of any one social group or historical category, but her life certainly had much to teach. And I look forward to exploring some of those things with you tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Donna. Let's go in this order. Mary Wingerd first, Linda Leighton second, Greg third. Okay?
Sure.
Okay, Mary, take it away.
Okay. Well, first of all, I wanted to tell Donna how much I appreciate this book. I've always been fascinated by Grace Carlson, and I learned so much more about her through your biography. And it certainly was aptly titled as The Fierce Life of Grace Carlson, because she was fierce in every sense of the word. She never gave half measure on anything. It was exhausting just to think about it. And I think this biography is valuable on its own merit as the story of Grace as an individual. because as a Minnesotan, she played a remarkable role here locally, and she's not very well known, either as a, if people know her, they know her primarily as one of the people who were convicted under the Smith Act in 41. I think there's been very little attention paid to her runs for public office, and certainly I had no idea about her role as a kind of foundational intellect behind the justification for St. Mary's Junior College. After she returns to Catholicism again, and that the kind of emerging feminism that she displays at that time, where she really sees patriarchy as separate from the struggle against capitalism, that they're distinct oppressions, right? So in that regard, I think just her story is valuable to know. But as interesting and as admirable as she is to us, she herself was not really a figure of national importance. So I think where the real contribution of your book is that context that you create that surrounds Grace's story. In large part, it's kind of a collective intellectual, emotional, political journey of people on the left from the 1920s forward into the 1950s and 60s. And I learned a lot about those movements through your book as well. A couple of the things that really struck me as really important was your delineation of the movement culture that sustained them, how it wasn't just the politics, how it was they were completely enveloped in this world that sustained them, but also demanded everything from them. And I thought about that a lot, how the cost, the personal cost of people who commit themselves to a cause that's so much bigger than themselves. And I've seen, you see it in many, many instances, how much the people closest to them suffer because the cause demands so much. And when you were speaking tonight, Donna, about how she challenged unquestioned conformity, and yet it's kind of ironic because once she's, in the SWP, any kind of diversion from the political line made you a pariah. It had some resonance about politics today, really, and how when she left, how alone she was, how she had to give up everything. There's so much in this book to talk about, but I'm going to stop right there and maybe chime in a little bit later because I want to leave time for the other commentators. And I just want to thank you for writing this terrific biography.
Thank you, Mary. Linda?
Oh, well, I had made a few notes while I was reading this book too. And I think, like Mary, the thing that really struck me was her awareness of feminism, because my impression of those times from hearing about it from my relatives, and I was born in 1948. I mean, I did see some, but I was a child, but I felt that they were very not feminist, and the women were always, except for running for office and maybe running a meeting, for the most part, the women were cooking and bringing things and picking up the pieces. And that's really how I saw it. And I loved her take on it and how she moved along on that, and especially enjoyed the part about when she was in the prison, when she's incarcerated, and what she learned from those kind girls who really had hard lives, and she really helped them and took up their cause and brought it with her, I think, after that. I don't really have much else to say. It was a very interesting read for me. And like you say, Mary, too, breaking away from that to go right into something else almost as wholeheartedly.
Daily Mass.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow.
Amazing thing. So that's really all I have to say.
Well, let me just ask, Linda, did you know Grace?
So I probably saw her, but of course you have to remember my times too and how old I was, right? And I went to things, but really just because my mother made me. And I have one story I'd like to relate, if I may.
Please.
My mother, when she was older, and we all went to the Minnesota History Center to see, at one time, just out of curiosity, to see some VHS tape they had of my grandfather, VR. We called him VR, Ray Dunn, and stuff that they had there that we had never, my brother and I had never seen, and my sister-in-law. And we took my mother, and I was very close to my mother, I believe, and I could see her tighten up and be upset without saying anything, in a good Scandinavian way of just being quite stoic about it. But when there were pictures of VR and Grace in the same scene at many party events in both California and New York. And after that, I thought about it, but I didn't think about it too much, to be honest with you, because it was kind of like, oh, well, and then I have little kids and we're moving along, and but I could tell that there was, and also when I asked her about visiting him, she and my grandmother, Jenny, I think only went up there once or maybe twice to Sandstone when he was in prison. And all they'd ever talk about was the ride up there, because it was a big deal. They didn't have a car, so they had to get somebody to drive them, and it took all day, and it was a big event in their lives. So that's all I need to say.
Thank you, Linda.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Greg, please.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks, Donna. What an adventure. In your acknowledgements, you talk about walking the halls of St. Patrick's School in Smithtown, New York, and the Academy of St. Joseph in Brentwood, New York, and about the lessons you learned from the Sisters of St. Joseph at both those institutions. And you talked about how that informed your understanding of Grace's life. I share that with you because I have quite a connection with the Sisters of St. Joseph. But I wanted to start with connections early on in the book. You talked about Grace. She was born in 1906, same year as my dad, Herman Poferl. She was baptized at St. Peter Claver. That's our parish where several of our grandkids have gone to school. Excuse me. St. Joe's, we have my wife, mother-in-law, cousins that all went to St. Joseph's. And the Sisters of St. Joseph were also a co-sponsor of Cretin-Derham Hall, where I taught in my second career. One of the things that jumped out at me in the book, I thought, oh my gosh, I missed her by 3 years. You talk about, she did a rally in 1958 at Cretin High School with Father Michael McDonough about the crisis of the modern world as technological development and how it is sought after as an end in itself. And quoting her, she says, the secularist materialistic view of progress has become a religion competing with Christianity. That just really jumped out at me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I started at Cretin in 1961. And in my generation, a lot of those friends that I went to school with and for years after, we didn't know much about Catholic social teaching. I certainly learned more when I came back to teaching, especially with Sisters of St. Joseph as co-sponsors. I hung around with the McDonald sisters, with Sister Rita Steinhagen and Betty and other sisters, well, since the late 1990s up until present. So wonderful, what a wonderful group of troublemakers, or they do good trouble, as John Lewis would say. Here's where I wanted to connect though. In the late 1990s, I was teaching labor history for the American Postal Workers Union, and I was reading about Cesar Chavez back in 1972. He was in the San Jose barrio, and Father McDonald told him about Rerum Novarum, the encyclical by Pope Leo XIII in 1891. And I went, holy cow, how come I didn't know about that? And pretty much that was Cesar Chavez's reaction. And when he learned that part of the founding principles of the Rerum Novarum Catholic social teaching was the dignity and worth of the workers and the right of the workers to join union and to organize unions and their rights to a decent living wage. So as somebody that's been in the labor movement for many years, and also a Catholic for many years, kind of like Grace, there was a time in my life where I kind of stepped out for a while, but a lot of the coming back was because of the Catholic social teaching. So I just wanted to share that. Fast forward in the late 1990s, I was and still a member of the Catholic Labor Network. And being in Washington, D.C. off and on for about 20 years, I'd go to a lot of their meetings and seminars. And my first impression was sitting around a room discussing labor issues, and all of a sudden realizing that about 7 or 8 of the men in the room were Catholic priests. They were just like regular union guys. It was really not an epiphany, but just certainly an extraordinary moment for me when I realized that that has been so much a part of my Catholic faith that I didn't know about. It was an untold story, or as we said, the best kept secret of the Catholic Church. What I want to end on, and hopefully we'll get some questions, is Rerum Novarum in 1891. Pope Leo XIII issued Rerum Novarum, which was revolutionary. It was about a revolutionary change in Catholic social teaching. And just years before that, there was Cardinal James Gibbon, who was the Archbishop of Baltimore, who was a key influence. He supported the Knights of Labor. And this was following the 1886 Haymarket strike, and Peter could always respond to that, but workers weren't, and the unionists weren't held in too high a regard after the Haymarket Square riot for various reasons. But Cardinal James Gibbons stood by the Knights of Labor and had an opportunity to get Pope Leo's ear and time with him. And he convinced him of the value of labor and how important that was. There was also Monsignor Edward Mcglinn, the people's priest during this time in New York and with the Irish, and he would have the unions from all the different trades meet in his basement, and they'd organize. Well, the cardinal at the time, Michael Corrigan, told him that he had to stop that. And if he didn't, he'd be excommunicated. And he said, I'd rather die than give up my time with the workers and their organizers. He was excommunicated. Lo and behold, here comes Pope Leo XIII in 1891 with Rerum Novarum, and he had to be restored to his priesthood. The reason I say that is because I'm looking at that context, and Archbishop Ireland and St. Paul really got behind Rerum Novarum and Catholic social teaching. One of his priests, I think it was, just give me a second here, I think it was
John Ryan.
John Ryan, a colleague of Ireland's, or a priest. He went on to teach at St. Paul's Seminary, and he did his doctoral dissertation on a living wage theory. I went, oh my gosh. And Ireland and with Father John Ryan, speeches and writings were published in the Union Advocate and in the Catholic Bulletin. So I'm thinking of Grace growing up in Frogtown, being baptized at St. Peter Claver, going to school at St. Vincent's. All the priests that Ryan taught were certainly many of them were at the St. Paul Seminary. So they had this full toolkit of Catholic social teaching to share with the grade school. And Grace says she learned and she was taught about Catholic social teaching at St. Joseph's. So I thought this was really interesting. But in his doctoral dissertation, Ryan said he saw a living wage as a sacred natural right, as an imperative higher than economic theories. Well, fast forward today, and we're arguing over a living wage. 100 years later, we're arguing over a $15 minimum wage. And I was just watching the debate between Bernie and one of the Republicans as far as looking at that living wage. And I think it's extraordinary. Peter always says the past is in constant conversation with the present. Well, I was right there today. And Donna, your book brought me to kind of those bookends. And I just thought how extraordinary it was that it had such a strong start that Grace's mother said, go with your father, because he was going to go back to work on the shopmen's strike in 1922. And she went with him. And after that, she says that she went to confession with a priest and confessed her sins that she crossed the picket line. Who does that?
Grace.
She was 15 years old. And I think of that wonderful foundation that she had, you know, of her faith, but of the working class.
Mm-hmm.
And those things that were so fundamental to her, to who she was, that at 15 years old, she had that sense. And it just wasn't a sin to cross picket lines. It was a sin to oppress the workers with low wages. So she was really my hero then. But I've got a question I'm going to throw out the when we get to it. But I have a question about the Berrigan brothers and Grace and how she wrote about them in her book. But that'll be later. But thank you for the wonderful adventure. There was just so many great connections for me. And like I told you earlier, I started taking notes and all of a sudden I thought I was making a lesson plan and I got to about 18 pages. I'm going to be teaching you a book sooner or later. So thank you so much.
Oh, great. Okay.
So let me just jump in and on that cue and let everyone know that Donna has put in the chat a secret code if you would like to purchase the book through the publisher. You can get a 30% discount.
And free
So
shipping.
that code, that information is in the chat. After listening to Mary and Linda and Greg, I should think everybody's going to want to go read the book. Donna, do you have any responses to?
Yeah, there's a couple of
they've had
threads
to
I
say?
thought I'd pick up on and then we can
Please.
keep going. It's funny, Mary, you mentioned that about the unquestioned conformity, because that hit me too when I structured my comments, but I kept it in there because she felt that way looking back at how she thought of herself in her childhood, that independent thinking. Mm-hmm. And I think in a sense, and she says this in an interview she did in 1987 with Carl Ross, looking back on her life, that clearly, she was in a movement, as you said, where there was a lot of, emphasis on conformity. But I think she held on to some of that, and that might have contributed to her eventual leaving the party, and kind of re-identifying herself. I think maybe there was something there too. And she later commented too on the not understanding what, the intensity of sectarianism until she kind of was on the other side of it when she left and what she went through. And, she was aware when she got into the party that, Vincent didn't talk to his brother Bill because, right? At the time she didn't understand, like, well, of course they wouldn't, but then later in life, looking back, I think she realized that there was something lost in that kind of commitment. And I think you're right too about the two-edged sword of the movement And I purposely chose that language, that they belonged to the party, because it's a two-edged sword, right? They belonged, that sense of community, but they belong, does it like it owned them, right?
Yeah.
You know, and I think you definitely feel that at certain moments, you know, when she's in prison and Rose Karsner is writing her, and it's like, you're not being disciplined enough, and you know, why are you wasting your time with this? And then Dorothy has to intervene and explain what she's doing in the clinic is actually going to be useful to her education and her work in the party, you know, just being under that scrutiny, you know, that was certainly a part of it. I think, you know, you're absolutely right that was a big part of the experience.
Well, you know, Donna, I wondered too, when you know, after her father died, I wondered if I got a sense of it from something that you wrote, that she felt that she had really caused her father a lot of pain with her politics, and that there was some guilt involved in that. There was a quote that you had in the book where she said she was certainly one of the reasons that he had so much trouble.
Yeah.
And I wondered if that didn't have some part in getting her to give up the party.
Yeah.
That, and of course her personal relationship, which seemed to be really fraught by that time too.
Yes, exactly. It's so hard, as you know, to kind of pinpoint it down with what the sources you have. You get glimpses, you get hints, and trying to bring it all together and corroborate and kind of go, you know, taking so much her own word, but then trying to kind of triangulate that. I think for sure it was more complicated than James Cannon, you know, attributed it to her just being worn down under the pressures of the second Red Scare and escaping. I think that was more than that for her. And I think it was a kind of conglomeration of those various factors that led her to that point, for sure. Yeah. I just wanted to pick up maybe on one thing Linda said and one thing Greg said, and then I can see there's hands and questions. It's interesting what you said about their feminism, because you're right. Like, so much of what these women were doing were sort of traditional female gender role things, you know, the cooking and the serving and the hosting, and you know, Grace was so known for her cooking and the lunches and the coffees. But what I loved was that she used that to bring people in and to hold a meeting, right? She kind of spun it on its head. And I think that's kind of, you know, what these women were doing. Like, you know, they weren't yet questioning those roles or pushing too much against them. They were navigating it. And the year that the leadership was in prison was really where you see them surging and having to fill, you know, step up more. And Grace really mentoring them from prison to be more active, to speak, to write.
I didn't ever think that they were, I'm not to say that there's not, I actually exalt the work they did. And I think that's what kept the party going, for God's sake.
Yeah.
I think that that's super valuable. I just think it wasn't at that time at all valued by men. But I think, you know, and those women had such camaraderie, really good friendships, it sounded like.
Yeah,
Definitely.
definitely.
Nice to see.
Yeah. And that sustained them and supported them in so many ways. You know, Grace never had children herself, but she was so connected to what that was like and what that meant in the day-to-day, especially through Dorothy,
Yes.
a lot of her other friends too, and how they had to balance that out. And kind of navigate that too. I found that
My heart was almost broken when she and Dorothy couldn't see each other, because I'm very close to my brother, and that's really would be a hardship.
Yeah. But they managed to find their way back to each other.
Thank goodness.
Nice part of the story. Yeah. And then Greg, that's so great. I didn't know you had all those personal connections. That's really remarkable that you missed Grace by just a few years. And I think you're absolutely right. A lot of it has to do, I think, you know, bishops matter. You know, like, they really do make a difference on your experience, I think, at the grassroots. And so much of Grace's formation was that neighborhood, was that parish, was that diocese. And thank you, Mary, for your book, because I could not have not contextualized that without your work that I, leaned into. But I think that absolutely, John Ireland, John Ryan, as you said, the priests, again, as far as I could piece together, there was a really high likelihood that they were trained in the seminary under Ryan and then went into those parishes. And so she had both the Josephites and these priests, and the exposure to that social teaching at a young age that I think really left a mark on her. And then she reconnected with that later in her life. Yeah.
And those nuns.
Yeah. And the role models they were, as, in so many ways, as highly educated, particularly at St. Catherine's, highly educated, many of them with PhDs, independent, running the show. And the numbers struck me I jotted it down. I think it was something like 28% went on to grad school compared to 5% at Hamline. So it was interesting. Some of it was because it wasn't co-ed, but I think a lot of it was that drive for them you are expected to be a leader, you're expected to give back to your community. I think that clearly was a part of what she, imbibed.
Well,
Boundless energy that she had.
Well, she instilled that professionalism, in the nurses, and she taught them how to be professional and married, you say. She was really concerned that many were leaving nursing when they married, and she says you can do both. Yeah. And what struck me, I have 5 daughters, 4 sons and 5 daughters, and 1 nurse, but she thought men should be dedicated to home and children just as much as the moms. So her feminism changed from challenging capitalistic oppression of women to challenging patriarchal structures. So she had the whole story going. I thought that was really commendable. And when you think at the time that she was making those arguments, I thought that was very significant.
I thought that was where I saw the kind of movement more towards that critique. And ironically, when she's back in the Catholic Church, and I think it was seeing the students, seeing the women students and their lives and their struggles, that she started to make those connections. She didn't, jettison the economic critique. She was also still very strong on like that kind of older labor feminism of unions and political power and childcare, and a lot of the stuff she and the other women in the SWP are writing about in the militant in the late 40s, birth control and things like that. Although she didn't speak on birth control, she spoke on pay and childcare and unions. But that quote you have there, Greg, that speech was, I think that was 1960. And that was really remarkable when I found that. Yeah. Okay.
So I just want to jump in and tell one little story, and then let's see, there are questions coming in. So on the issue of women doing the cooking and making the coffee and running the meetings, I was reminded of first the essay that Marjorie Penn Lasky wrote, critiquing the Ladies Auxiliary in the 1934 Minneapolis Teamster strike, in which, and it was a really great kind of collision of second wave feminism with this earlier version of feminism in the 30s. And I was fortunate to be around Meridel Lesueur when that essay was published. And Meridel had, of course, written an essay called When I Was Marching, about the Ladies Auxiliary in the 34 strike. And Meridel was furious at this article by Marjorie Penn Lasky and said she didn't understand anything about what it was like to actually be there and how empowering it had been for the women during the 34 strike and the impact that had on them throughout their lives. So Meridel never had the chance to write anything in response, but I wanted to invoke her tonight. And certainly
Excellent.
she and Grace must have interacted on many occasions. Robin, do you want to ride herd on and bring some of the questions in? And I see someone has politely raised his mechanical hand, and
Sure, thank you, Peter. We had several questions from Kyle. And he attends the militant labor forums today, and it's hard to imagine the picture that was included in the slideshow that featured Carlson, Cannon, Dunn, etc., with a full house behind them. Can you help contextualize socialism and the working class and union movement in the 30s and 40s when that picture was taken? And it looks like it was on figure 9 from your book, Professor. So I don't have the book in front of me, so I'm not sure what picture that is, but he had a question about that.
This one, I think it's this one.
I think it's that one, yes. And if right, so he's asking if you can contextualize that a bit more and then compare it to today.
Yeah, this is from, I believe this one is from the Minnesota Historical Society collection. And I don't think it had a date on it, but just kind of judging by the folks here and, knowing, triangulating the moment, this has got to be, I would say, in the 40s. And it was robust. I mean, in St. Paul and Minneapolis, the party branches were quite active. I don't have my finger on precise numbers. And then, of course, it depends on what we're looking at. If we're looking at a Sunday forum, maybe, where they opened up and they had more folks coming, not necessarily party members, where they did talks on, relevant issues. And those were the moments when, some of the women would give presentations on sort of current event issues. You would get a larger crowd than if they were having a kind of smaller, executive committee meetings on a Wednesday night or something like that. So I imagine this would probably have been one of those larger events. And that, of course, changes by the time we get to the early 50s, after Grace leaves the party. I talk a little bit about this in the book. The branches, actually, the numbers are dwindling so much, they're struggling, on a variety of fronts in the context of the Second Red Scare, difficulty recruiting and retaining folks, because as now we know, they were targeted under COINTELPRO, and that was kind of wreaking havoc with their work. And the branches actually merged in 1955, I believe, because they couldn't sustain both branches. And there was a period of kind of infighting, and it got difficult because everybody was under pressure. There was kind of anxieties, over what was happening in the world and how they were responding as a party. But then, anxieties over critiques that perhaps might be opening up to something more threatening. That put pressure on the party. But for sure, a lot of the momentum was built coming out of the 34 strikes, and that continued into the 40s through the trial. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Robin, do you want to unmute David, and who's politely raised his mechanical hand, and see what he wanted to ask?
Yes, David, you may unmute. That should be there. And I'm trying to get back to Kyle's question. I apologize for the pause there. It's not letting me scroll back. But Deborah also, until we get to David, Deborah had a comment that she also missed Grace by just a couple of years when she graduated from St. Mary's Junior College. But Grace's mark on the curriculum was definitely there. Half of the credits were in the liberal arts, since Grace insisted there was nothing too good for the workers. And she saw this nursing education as an open door to a rich intellectual and community life. She was clearly well loved and respected by the sisters, faculty, and students there. So if any of you would like to make a comment on her mark on education, I think that would be really great.
Yeah, that's my sense from the research, and especially a special thanks to Peter DeHealy, who shared his memories of his time working with Grace at St. Mary's Junior College, and the importance of the St. Mary's Plan, which she and Sister AJ co-wrote, the sort of mission statement for the school and the kind of structure of the curriculum. And that was very much at the core, was the importance of liberal arts, the importance of educating, not just technical training for nursing skills, that was important, but having the liberal arts and then the spiritual dimension of the education as well, directed towards serving God and serving man, right? That was always at the core. And so you really hear that, you know, that echo of her early education with the Josephites, and again, of course, with Sister AJ, who was a Josephite. It really had that fingerprints all over that. Yeah.
And I just say that of course is bread and roses.
Yeah.
The liberal stuff.
Yeah, you know, it's so funny because there's so many ways the worlds connect, you know,
Yes,
the
there is.
commitment,
Yes, there
the
is.
vision, the millennialist kind of vision. Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's that's where Steve Rossworm, I stole from him, you know, that elective affinity, right? You know, of these worlds for each other. That it's not uncommon to see this among folks from both these worlds. Yeah.
Well, it seems really clear from your writing that Grace was profoundly an intellectual.
Mhm.
And so she was really that part of the old left. I mean, the way you talked about how she sort of disparaged the Dorothy Day kind of approach to dealing with poverty.
Mhm.
And didn't really go for the bargains. It was all too individualistic. And in fact, the only way to really change things was to educate people so they would know how to transform the system. And that seemed to be consistent throughout her life. And it makes sense that she believed in that at St. Mary's too, that because these most of what she, you know, working class girls who weren't going to get a 4-year education. Nothing was too good for these girls. They should have their kind of intellectual full measure as well.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, you're right. It's that thread that runs through all those different facets, and education and building a movement, right? And I love her comment in her speech on the New Left. You know, it's not about doing what feels good, it's doing about what you need for the movement.
Right.
Yes. And you know, her critique of the Berrigans was a bit sharp, you know, and you really hear the Trotskyism there, you know, this like these kind of, you know, they're kind of petty bourgeois, you know, undisciplined, anarchistic, you know, it's like, okay then, you know. Yeah.
So David, can you speak?
Yeah,
Please, you
hear
have the
me?
floor, the veritable virtual floor.
You hear me? My picture's been muted also apparently. I tried to sign in, they won't let me start it. But you can hear my voice, so that's all.
Yes.
This has been really fascinating to me. I never heard of Grace Carlson until today. Or I got a notice, an email about this event, and I thought, oh, I better check this out, because I've taught for many years at Loyola University in Chicago. I retired last year. I'm living up in the Minnesota area, St. Paul area. And I was invited to give a talk at Providence College. I wrote an article on Marxism and religion. And was invited to be a keynote address for their conference on Catholic social teaching. And it got canceled because of COVID. But another colleague of mine has been doing a lot of research on Dorothy Day. And he said, well, can you write something for our journal, a Catholic journal, listening about Dorothy Day and Marxism? And now I see this other Marxist, Catholic, whatever, so I'm really fascinated. I'm definitely going to buy your book right away. And I was just wondering, the last question was reference to Dorothy Day. So did she meet Dorothy Day? She's clearly got a critique of Dorothy Day. I'm just really curious about that story.
Yes, yeah. I mean, they're kind of the obvious. Dorothy Day is sort of the obvious figure that people want to know about, and like.
And she's up for canonization this year.
Yes. Grace mentioned that she did meet her once. She gave a speech at Mary House, which is one of the Catholic worker houses. I forget the exact year now. I want to say in the late 50s. I did jot that down somewhere because I knew people were going to ask me about 1957. She gave a speech at Mary House in 1957.
Okay.
But I think that was the extent of their personal, interaction. In her correspondence, Grace was, and in the oral history, she said she found Dorothy Day to be a little sappy, and what does she mean by this? And I think it was, as Mary was saying earlier, just the personalism, that approach didn't work for Grace, because I respect that path, and I can see that in some ways, just as if not harder, right, affecting change that way. But for Grace, it didn't connect, it didn't make sense, the little way she always was going after, and she says this in other contexts in her correspondence, where is the economic power? When people in the church reach out to her, in the Vatican II era, wanting her to get on board different reforms in the church, she's like, yeah, maybe, but like we really need to be dealing with the Chamber of Commerce, or like we have to aim, where their power is. So I think that was part of it, but I also in some ways find that, somewhat ironic, because in some ways Grace was also doing a kind of slow way, little way, but through education, right, of these women, to advance and to change and to challenge the system. She was attracted to the English slant movement, but I think that was more philosophical. She did, I have references to her establishing a branch at St. Mary's Junior College, which I thought was pretty astounding, but I couldn't find much more detail on that. So, she certainly remained, as you said, in her mind a Marxist, but I think also in her approach, and in her critiques. She also, I think this is where there's like an old left, new left divide too. Not that I would put Dorothy Day in the new left, but certainly the Catholic left and the Berrigans, she felt uncomfortable with I think Dorothy Day did too in some ways. That kind of the individual acts of witness that are so public, Grace felt it would turn people off. She thought it was esoteric, that it was bizarre, pouring blood over draft cards, that it was, she started quoting, left-wing infantilism, then she went there, like that was part of her critique. So she's just so complicated. And that's where I think, I have a piece coming out in the Catholic Historical Review where I drill down more on this very question about rethinking the Catholic left, Grace and rethinking the Catholic left.
When is that coming out?
In the winter issue, so it should be soon.
Catholic, what's it called? Catholic
Historical Review.
Catholic
Yeah. And so, I dig down more deeply than I did in the book on the comparisons with Dorothy Day and the Berrigans, and kind of situating Grace more in that world of what's happening on the Catholic left.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for explaining that. And that was one of the big questions that I had. So thank you and for Mary. To me, I don't know, I just didn't get it at first, and it just kind of pushed me back. I'm going, whoa. Peter and I have been at seminars with Daniel Berrigan and how the force of the metaphors. And I've been with the Catholic social workers in many demonstrations. So he kind of held them in esteem. And then all of a sudden I'm going,
Yes.
wow, Dorothy is a little sappy. And she calls Berrigan kind of individualist, petty bourgeois.
Yeah.
I'm just going, my head, I wasn't understanding. So thank you so much. But she looked at it as far as I think I understand, because she included that clipping, right? With 91% opposition to the draft off
Right,
this
right,
weekend.
right,
And
right.
she took issue that as far as that individualism, like you explained, within that context of individualistic, she said it really alienated the majority. And I think
Right.
that's what she took issue with.
Right.
Not that they didn't come back later in defense of Dorothy Day and the Berrigans. They did do some educating and expanding because that knowledge of their individualist actions gave them somewhat of a platform. But
Right.
I thought that was really interesting. So thanks, because
Okay, great.
she's still my hero.
Robin, is there more to tap into that's come in the chat?
I don't see anything on Facebook, but Kyle had another question. What movements might Carlson have supported today? And what actions or trends would she have seen as anathema to building a broad-based movement?
Well, that's a good question.
I think she'd be against the Biden administration personally.
You think? Yeah. Well, I think she would have supported Black Lives Matter. I mean, she was very active in the St. Paul NAACP when she ran for office. Equality for African Americans was a part of her platform, as for women. She and Dorothy were very active on that front, and protesting Jim Crow segregation in the St. Paul Hotel and things like this. So I think she certainly would have supported that movement. I'm trying to think more broadly. I mean, certainly the fight for 15, although that would be a limited initial step. I think she would be supporting that. What she would find, was it divisive? Was that it? What was the language there? I apologize.
No, that's all right. What would she have seen as anathema to building a broad-based movement?
It's hard to know. It's hard to connect precisely. We were just talking about her critique of the individual actions. So I'm trying to think what would be the equivalent to today that she would be offended by. I'm not sure. But yeah, apologies. I'm kind of, this is where I quote one of my colleagues, like I'm a historian, so I'm stuck in the past. It's hard to kind of draw linkages.
I think she would have been really excited about the advances at St. Kate's and with the women's studies program and how they did that over the years.
Yeah, that's true. And I didn't realize until I did the research how Dorothy kind of had a second act with the women's studies librarian in Madison, and really important in collecting that bibliography and her work there. But yeah, I mean, I think she would, I often think, where would she put herself, within the church now? I think, where she always had been. She had this interesting kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? She sort of, from what I could tell, kind of liturgically conservative, but socially very, very, liberal, even radical. she was close to the sisters and to many priests, the Benedictines that she corresponded with from St. John's. And so I think she was hesitant to kind of call for reform in the church, but she understood it as connected. Any kind of reform that was going to happen had to include not just lay people, but religious, and had to be aimed at something larger and structural and societal. So I think she would be with those folks in the church today, and not other folks. Just leave it at that.
Well, she never hesitated to criticize the parish priest at St. Leo's, on the,
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
you do, he was like, my country, right or wrong? She goes,
Yes.
you're wrong.
Yeah, I think it's good for people to hear about inequality, and that was a real glimpse into the inner workings that you often don't see. I thought that was really fascinating, that letter.
And you'll see that in churches today, the various churches that are more progressive and others, as far as when they make, I'm trying to think it is, but when they do the concessions or whatever, we pray for the undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, the prayers of the faithful are very telling about the politics of the pastor.
And I think that's where she got into it with the priest, because he was saying like, well, Grace, that's pretty radical.
Yeah, she never remains quiet. She always is able to respond. Yeah. I hope that was helpful, Kyle. I didn't mean to be dismissive. It's just hard for as soon as we get off the call, 10 things will come to my head. Yeah.
So we have a question from David Sundin about, in your research process, did you talk with members of Grace's family?
I did actually, and I think Raymond is here tonight. Raymond Schultz, Dorothy's son. I think he's on the call. I don't know if he logged off, but
no, he's here. Yeah,
he's here. Yes, he was extremely helpful, shared his memories, and was so humble. I don't know if this will be helpful. It was a gold mine. It was wonderful insights into their lives, his childhood. I really couldn't have completed the latter half of the book without those insights to kind of piece together what was happening with Dorothy and Henry and Anne. And, that was really important. That was such a central part for Grace too, to understand that. So that was really, really helpful. I believe he was the only one from her family that I was able to connect with. And then of course, some of her colleagues were also incredibly generous and helpful. Peter, Bill Morgan, and others who just, it was wonderful. Yeah, really helped provide insights, because her papers are so rich, but especially in the prison year, and for her campaign years. And then there are certain gaps, right? And a lot of the stuff from her years teaching, the notes of her speeches were really rich, but it was trying to figure out what was happening in the personal life. And that's where Raymond's memories were really, really tremendously helpful.
So I see that Raymond has unmuted, which might mean that he's ready to say something.
Yes, please.
Raymond, do you want to speak up?
I would be happy to. Are you hearing me now?
We're hearing you loud and clear. Yes, sir.
Donna, I am totally impressed with your book. And thank you so much for sharing my family and my aunt with everybody.
Oh, thank you.
I think that an underlying perspective that will help understand Grace more was she was a Trotskyist. She left the party for a whole bunch of different reasons, but one of the bigger ones was Stalin. And the SWP moved more toward the support of Stalin in the 50s. There was a lot of internal conflict. Grace did not like Stalin. Grace's underlying philosophy from the Sisters of St. Joseph and from Stalin coalesced with each other in a belief of people, a belief of education, a belief of bring people together, ask them their ideas, explore what could be thought about, and then move forward. So Grace is always about education. She always was in conflict with the Catholic Church because they didn't follow the Sisters of St. Joseph and their belief of the people. So, you know, and then she would cook for you, and if you would eat it, she would talk to you forever.
Oh, thank you, Raymond, so much. It's great
Thank
to see
you.
you. We've been corresponding, but this is my first time seeing you, as it were.
Yeah, I'm happy to see you, and I can't wait to sometime we can actually meet. And that'll
In
be
person, I know,
in
absolutely. Oh, thank you so much. But I have, again, really seriously, your correspondence was really, really invaluable. Wonderful, wonderful
Well,
memories.
I learned a lot about Grace's life from you. I just lived it with her. You know, I'm what they call a red diaper baby. I grew up with Trotsky and Marx in my family and in my home. And so to have people say, why did people fight for these kinds of things? Why could you know, feminism and labor history and education were all the same, you know, and so hopefully, yeah, I'm privileged to have had that for me. I wish we could do more for other people today.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. That's fabulous. Thank you.
Great. There was someone's asking, where are Grace's papers, Donna?
They're at the Minnesota Historical
They are.
Society. Yeah, in the library there.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. So, Robin, shall we end the formal part of this and allow people to chit chat a little bit?
I think that would be great. Again, I want to thank Donna and Greg, Linda, and Mary for an absolutely fabulous conversation. I also did not know anything about Grace Carlson. I haven't had a chance to read the book, but I'm really looking forward to it. And this has been a wonderful look into a slice of life with a woman who was forgotten, I believe. And to bring her back is just fantastic.